Interesting. Okay, Rabbi Elton, I should say, are you okay if we get started? Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So I'll mute myself in a moment. I just wanted to introduce Rabbi Ben Elton, who is both very far away and also very close to our community. Before I came on the scene, he was an intern at Ohev. I don't know if you had a different title other than that, because I know that you spent much time at Ohev and developed close friendships with many of the folks in our community. And so I know that many people are excited to see you, I guess, for the first time in almost 8 years. And so, yeah, it's really wonderful to have you. I know that it kind of blows my mind that it is lunchtime in Australia right now, in Sydney, where he is currently a rabbi at a community there. And as you can probably tell from the accent, if you don't already know him, originated in England and has done a lot of work as well as a rabbi also in researching the history of the position of the chief rabbi. And of course, sadly, that is a timely conversation topic because of the death of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. And so we wanted to make sure to honor the memory of him. And what better way to have Rabbi Elton come back. Also, amazingly from Australia. I am drinking a cup of tea in your honor. And so if you would like, I'd like to ask you to share what is most comfortable for you in terms of comments, questions. Would you like people to mute themselves if they have questions? Would you prefer that they put in the chat, save questions to the end? And so I just want to thank you again, and I will now mute myself and let you take over from here.
Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be back at Ohev, which is a really important part of my rabbinic development. It was through Rabbi Herzfeld's encouragement that I really, one of the reasons I made the shift to actually becoming a rabbi. I was in New York, I thought, for a year, and then Rabbi Dr brought me for a Shabbos to visit him. He's an old friend from university, and I think I spoke on that occasion. Rabbi Herzfeld told me to become a rabbi, and everyone does what Rabbi Herzfeld tells them. So, and here we are all these years later. And then he very kindly employed me as an intern for 2 summers, and then coming monthly the time in between. And that was incredibly important in terms of building experience of all aspects of the rabbinic job, and also just seeing Rabbi Herzfeld at work. So everyone knows the impact he had on Ohev in the years since he came there. And when I came to the Great Synagogue, it had a very fine name, and a very fine history, but it was rather in the doldrums, and it had a difficult few years, no rabbi for a year or so, a difficult period before that, and there was lots of work that needed to be done to revive it, including, I might add, communal lunches, free communal lunches, which I brought in as an homage to Ohev, and thank God we've had similar results to Ohev Sholom, and the community is in a much better position. Even notwithstanding COVID, even with the challenges of COVID, I think we're still in a much stronger position we were 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and I think we'll bounce back. We were all very shocked, I think. By the way, I think I'll take questions and comments at the end. I'm always very keen to take comments and questions. It's just a case of the handling the technology and the interface. So I think it's just easier at the end, and then everyone can go for their life, as they say in Australia. We were all very shocked, I think, a month ago when Rabbi Sacks died. We'd only heard a couple of weeks before that he was even sick. And I think we were hoping and maybe even expecting that he would come through. And then we heard the terrible news that he passed away. And there's been a lot of consideration of his life and his contribution since he passed away. And I want to share some of my thoughts at Maharat Ruth's invitation. And I think even at a month's distance, we can step back a little more than in the first shock and grief of his passing. And I want in particular to look at where he stands in relation to his Anglo-Jewish background, because although he became in many ways the chief rabbi of the world and had enormous impact in America and in Israel and elsewhere, and was really recognized and learned from all over the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world as well, He comes out of England. In fact, I think he's the most English chief rabbi there's ever been, because almost no chief rabbis were born in England, and even those who were first generation, were the children of immigrants, whereas Rabbi Sacks came from an English home and was himself born in England. So he's a very, very English figure. Never really studied outside England for any length of time, either in his Jewish learning or in his wider learning. Never had a job outside England, although he did apply for some jobs early in his career outside England. Never got one. Always spent his entire career, all the way until he retired as chief rabbi in 2013. The entire time, his entire career was spent in England. So really you have to understand him as an English figure above all. So let's begin with just a bit about Anglo-Jewry, and why Anglo-Jewry is a peculiar place to come from in Jewish terms, in rabbinic terms. England has never been a particularly intense Jewish environment. So whereas you had very remarkable figures in Germany before the war, in Russia, obviously before the war, Lithuania, the great centers of the Shivot, the great centers of modern Orthodoxy, of the modern Slavic Judaism. America had YU and the JTS and HUC for the Orthodox and the conservative and the Reform movement, and also the yeshivot of Lakewood and Torah Vodaas and so on and so forth. England has always been on a much smaller scale. There is the Gateshead Yeshiva in the northeast of England for sort of traditional, as a traditional yeshiva, and there was Jews College, which was for the centre, the Orthodox centre, but also always sort of limped along with various periods of strength, more strength and less strength, but never really established itself like a YU, like a JTS, like a Berlin or Breslau Seminary in Germany before the war. So London in particular has always been regarded as a place which never produced great Torah scholars, never produced great rabbis. So when you have a figure of the stature of Rabbi Sacks coming out of England, it's something really remarkable. And the Chief Rabbinate of Britain, which is the position he filled for the longest period in his career, is also unusual. When there were chief rabbi posts around the world before the Second World War, they were generally speaking appointed by the government. Either they were appointed by the government and the community accepted them, like in the case of France, Paris, and the other major cities where there is a consistoire, and the government-sponsored religious institutions produce a chief rabbi and the community accepts them. Or you have the cases in Russia where there's the state rabbi and he's not really taken very seriously by the community itself. He fulfills a public role or a role which is helpful to the government, but he isn't taken as a major rabbinic figure by the Jews themselves. In Britain, it was different. In Britain, you have a situation where the chief rabbi grows out of, organically, grows out of the community. Specifically in London, before the in the 18th century, there was basically one major synagogue, the Great Synagogue, and then different other synagogues broke away or were founded or had to be established because they were too far from the Great Synagogue, but they couldn't afford their own rabbi, so they turned to the rabbi of the Great Synagogue to act in that capacity. And he therefore became a de facto chief rabbi, and from the 1840s he was called chief rabbi as well. So the chief rabbinate in Britain is an indigenous institution. It's an organic institution that came out of a need of the community, and therefore the authority has always been entirely voluntary. Anyone who wants to accept the chief rabbi's authority can do so or not. A shul can choose to belong to the United Synagogue or not. A shul outside of London can choose to accept his authority or not, and they don't need to. So shuls which are both more progressive would reject his authority. Shuls which are more traditionalist also reject the chief rabbi's authority, but he is the leader by consent of the group of shuls in the middle. So it's a very precarious situation. It has no government backing, it has no official force. Everything is done ultimately voluntarily, but at the same time, there's great prestige attached to the office. If you think of at least 3 of the last 4 chief rabbis, each of them was an enormous figure. Rabbi Hertz, who of course wrote the commentary to the Chumash, which is still very popular and you can see in many places. Rabbi Jacobovitz, who established himself as the major moral religious voice in Britain during his chief rabbinate in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then Rabbi Sacks, who I think arguably raised the chief rabbinate's prestige to unprecedented heights. Now, interestingly enough, Rabbi Sacks himself did not come from a synagogue that was affiliated with the chief rabbinate. So in the 19th century, you had the United Synagogue, which was a anglicized and modern Orthodox institution. And they built very grand synagogues. So Jews who wanted to really become more English in their style of worship and just their social presentation. The Jews from Eastern Europe, freshly arrived off the boat in the East End of London, were not really at home in synagogues with robes and a choir, especially with a mixed choir of men and women, and all the formality, the top hats and so on for the wardens. So they founded their own shtiblach, and these shtiblach were pretty ineffectual and disorganized. So they were organized by Lord Swathling, who was an Orthodox banker, into what's called the Federation of Synagogues. So the Federation of Synagogues has always been just a touch more traditionalist, a touch more Hamish, a touch more sort of resistant to authority than the United Synagogue. The United Synagogue is very, very keen on hierarchy and formality, and having a very much a pecking order, like archbishops and bishops and priests and so on and so forth. The Federation's always a bit more distrustful of that, and Rabbi Sacks was brought up in a Federation of Synagogues. So he was brought up in Finchley Central Federation Synagogue, and that's where he was bar mitzvah. So he was always a bit of an outsider as regard the United Synagogue. He came to lead it. They were his largest part of his constituency, but he himself didn't come from that background. He came from this slightly more resistant to authority and hierarchy sort of place. The family is not fully observant, but very involved in the synagogue, and his mother comes from a rabbinic line. So Rabbi Frumpkin, who was a scholar of the Siddur, one of his ancestors. He went to a non-Jewish school, but he went to Bnei Akiva. So there was a strong Jewish input in his upbringing. And then he went to Cambridge. And by his own account, when he was at Cambridge, as this sort of young star of the philosophy department, as an undergraduate, he wasn't particularly interested in the Jewish aspect of his life. I suppose he's exploring other parts of his interests. But the Six-Day War changed that. He was born in 1948, and in 1967 he's 19 years old, and he finds himself at Cambridge, and he goes to the Cambridge shul like everyone else to pray for Israel's survival in the Six-Day War. And that was the beginning of a shift away from a purely secular intellectual life. It's more towards a Jewish life and a life engaged with Judaism. I think he referred to himself at one point as a lapsed atheist. He was perhaps for a time, maybe not atheist exactly, but less inclined towards religion. But that comes to a pretty sudden halt in the late 60s. And in fact, he decides in 1968 during the summer vacation to go to America and to go and see some leading rabbis and to ask them for their advice on how he should spend his life. So he goes and sees two people primarily, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik of YU and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And in fact, we hear much more from Rabbi Sacks in his later career about his interaction with the Rebbe than we do with his interaction with Rabbi Soloveitchik. He said Rabbi Soloveitchik taught him how to think, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe taught him how to lead. And Rabbi Soloveitchik presumably gave him some encouragement and told him to pursue higher Jewish learning. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, you must become a rabbi, and you must become the teacher of rabbis. And that's what he did. And in fact, he remained in contact with the Lubavitcher Rebbe at an important point in his career. Whether he should become chief rabbi, for example, he consulted the Rebbe, and he was a very important figure. His first book, in fact, in 1986, was a book called Torah Studies, which is a series of translations of the Rebbe's Sichot on the parasha of the week. So I think you learn two things from this. One is, although he was very much in what we would call modern orthodoxy, he himself rejected that description. He said, I don't want to become a minority in a minority in a minority. So the modern Orthodox are a minority of the Orthodox, a minority of the Jews, a minority of the world population. So I don't need to box myself into such a small position. So, but we might call him modern Orthodox. But I think his real hero from afar was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And that, I think, accounts for a lot of his traditionalism and conservatism. I think for two reasons. I think he's sometimes seen as a more progressive figure than he actually was. The two reasons are because he was so at home in Western thought and culture, you might think that he therefore is quite progressive or liberal on certain issues. I don't think that was the case. And also because of Dignity of Difference, his book in the early 2000s, which had a couple of passages which people found theologically objectionable, therefore he must be quite radical theologically. I don't think he was. I think they were really outliers. It's also worth saying that I don't think he ever really argued with the Lubavitcher Rebbe's teachings in public. He may not have agreed with all of them, but he doesn't take issue with them. Whereas one of his early articles, which actually is on Chabad.org, interesting enough, is a critique of Rabbi Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith, arguing that one does not need to be lonely as a religious person, whereas for Rabbi Soloveitchik, loneliness is an essential condition of the religious person. So there's an admiration for Rabbi Soloveitchik, but there isn't the same, I think, passionate identification and relationship as there is with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. In fact, there's a story which I wouldn't write down, but I'm willing to say orally, that at one point in his life, he was very connected to Chabad in London, and he came home from Purim Suda a little bit worse for wear one year, and his wife Elaine said, "Right, that's it. There's no more Lubavitch for you. We're going to keep things more sober." So for a time, he definitely was very connected to Chabad. So he came back to the Jewish community and continued to pursue his academic studies, and takes his degree in philosophy and takes a PhD in philosophy, becomes a philosophy lecturer at Middlesex University. But he does decide, in fact, to head towards the rabbinate. He always said he came to the rabbinate late. And in the early 1970s, when he's about 25, he enters Jews College. Now, the principal of Jews College at that point was, I think, the greatest traditional scholar ever to be the principal of Jews College. There'd been serious scholars before and after, but they were more of a sort of Western bent, more sort of academic, whereas in their Jewish studies. Whereas Nachum Rabinovich, who died also fairly recently, just a few months ago, was a star in the traditional yeshiva sense. Brilliant mind. He wrote a very long commentary on the whole of the Mishnah Torah by the Rambam eventually, and just a brilliant yeshiva scholar. He also had a PhD in mathematics, so he had secular learning, but his Jewish study was of a very traditional and brilliant sort of comprehensive type. And Rabbi Sacks regarded Rabbi Rabinovich as his personal Rebbe, his personal teacher. So although the Lubavitcher Rebbe was a sort of hero from afar, his personal inspiration and guide was Rabbi Rabinovich, and he consulted him on many issues all the way until Rabbi Rabinovich passed away. And one of the last videos Rabbi Sacks made was a eulogy for Rabbi Rabinovich. They not only studied at Jews College in a formal sense, they also had a private chavrusa, or a private shiur, for, I think, 12 years. They learned together. So while it's sometimes said that Rabbi Sacks's traditional learning was limited, in fact, he was learning one-on-one for a very significant amount of time with one of the great rabbinic scholars of his age, and would have therefore picked up a great deal. Also, his brilliance would have enabled him to leapfrog over the other students, which I know from people who were there in Jews College with him, that he came in behind them and he was very soon way out in front of them. He also studied at the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, which is the traditional yeshiva in London, and he received smicha from both institutions. He had smicha from Jews College and also smicha from Yeshiva Eitz Chaim at the same time. So he was also balancing there. While he was at Jews College, he was already teaching. He taught Jewish philosophy and even taught Talmud at Jews College, even while he was still a student there. That's how advanced he was, at least by the end of his time as a student, as a smicha student in Jews College. And in 1982, just 4 years after he graduated, he becomes the professor of Jewish philosophy at Jews College. And he's also, at this point, the rabbi of the Golders Green Synagogue. Golders Green is obviously a very Jewish center. And in those days, Golders Green Synagogue was one of the flagship synagogues of the United Synagogue. Interestingly enough, and it's a minor point, but I think worth mentioning, the legend is he was the first of the United Synagogue ministers to refuse to wear the rabbinic robes. And I think in this, although as chief rabbi, he had a very formal sort of ceremonial role on many occasions, his personal inclination was as an intellectual, as a philosopher, as somebody interested in ideas and not somebody interested in formality or in ceremonial. You know, obviously interested in halacha and interested in the appropriate ritual observance, but anything outside of that, the whole sort of pomp and circumstance of Anglo-Jewish life, which is a creation of the 19th century, he had very little patience for. And people talked about how when he would go into a shul as chief rabbi, he would enter, you know, without, and not in a very formal way, but full of energy and full of excitement and warmth and engagement and love children. He used to say, "I want to be remembered as the man who gave sweets to the children." There was a fundamentally informal aspect of Rabbi Sacks, even though he was capable of giving these extraordinary, very formal presentations, either sermons or lectures. But at heart, there was a great informality, which also interacts interesting with his shyness. Also a shy man who said that he would have an easier time talking to 1,000 than talking to 3 people. All these things are in tension or in relationship with each other in his personality. The intellectual, the chassid, the shy person, the brilliant intellect, it's all a very interesting mixture. So in 1982, he moves from Golders Green to Marble Arch Synagogue, another flagship synagogue, which now allows him more time to be the principal of Jews College, to succeed his teacher, Rabbi Rabinovich, as the principal of Jews College. And at this point, it's worth saying that his writings and his sermons are not easy. He became very well known for producing such accessible, inspiring, enthusing presentations, whether in writing or in speech, live. That wasn't the case with his early work. If you read his early articles, they're very difficult, they're very dense. I was told by somebody who's a member of my shul, who was a member of Golders Green shul when he was the rabbi, that no one understood his sermons. So, and this is what Diane Ivan Binstock said in his eulogy for the chief rabbi for Rabbi Sacks at his funeral. He said, and this is in praise of Rabbi Sacks, not to his detriment, he worked on his presentation. It wasn't his natural way of expressing himself, particularly after years in a pure academic context. He had to develop that ability or find that innate ability and then draw it out to communicate with people in an accessible and an inspiring way, as opposed to leaving people with a consciousness that he was brilliant, but not necessarily know what he'd actually said. Now, when he's in Anglo-Jewry, active in Anglo-Jewry in the early 80s, as an up-and-coming figure, he's rather more relaxed about certain things than he became later. So, for example, the Limud Conference was founded in 1980 and was always cross-denominational, not just Orthodox figures, but all figures from all over the denominations. And he went. In the early years, he went to Limud. He didn't go when he was chief rabbi. That became politically too difficult for him. But in the early years, he went to Limud. He wasn't very concerned about there being non-Orthodox people there. And he even gave Talmud tuition to the rabbinical students of Leo Beck College, which is the Reform Seminary in London. He didn't go to the college, Leo Beck College itself, but he did teach them at his home. And it was a formal engagement that he taught the Leo Beck students, Talmud as part of their course. So he wasn't very concerned about that either. That also might be the influence of Chabad. You know, wherever the Jews are, that's where you go, and nothing else is as important as that. He looks beyond the bounds of Anglo-Jewry at this point. So he creates a journal, Le'ela, out of Jews College to reach a wider audience, just like Tradition really is the journal that comes out of YU. And he also arranges conferences. For example, the Traditional Alternative Conference of 1989, when he brought a series of very important figures from around the world, including Rabbi J. David Bleich and Rabbi David Hartman. They all came to London to take part in this wildly successful conference. So by the late 1980s in Britain, he's really making a name for himself as a unique figure in the rabbinate. Somebody who's capable of being principal of Jews College, and also a very gifted academic philosopher, and an organizer, somebody who can produce successful events and really make an impact. And so he's emerging as the favorite to succeed Rabbi Jacobowitz. Rabbi Jacobowitz had been there since 1967. He was not only German, he was rather Germanic in his mode. He was rather socially conservative. He was sort of aligned rather with Margaret Thatcher and her policies. And Rabbi Sacks was English-born, a Cambridge gentleman, and seemed more progressive in all sorts of ways. So the icing on the cake was probably the Ruth lectures. So in an extraordinary recognition of his status as a philosopher and theologian in general, in 1990, even before he was chief rabbi, he was invited by the BBC to give the Ruth lectures, which are the most distinguished series of lectures, which are given each year on the BBC, broadcast live by some very distinguished figure. And he was the Ruth lecturer for the year before he became chief rabbi. So recognition was not of the wider community. Didn't just start when he became chief rabbi and had that platform. It really dated back even before, when he was still a candidate for the chief rabbinate. And then he has this very serious backing of very wealthy, influential individuals in the community, including a man called Stanley Carms, and they really push him very hard to accept the chief rabbinate, and he does so in 1991 and succeeds Chief Rabbi Jacobowitz. Now, Rabbi Jacobowitz was going to be a very hard act to follow. He'd been knighted, became Sir Emanuel Jacobowitz. He became Lord Jacobowitz with a seat in the House of Lords. He won the Templeton Prize for Religion, and it was well known that he was referred by Margaret Thatcher to the Archbishop of Canterbury. So, and then within the community also, enormously respected, very highly regarded, and able even to take certain controversial positions. For example, he's very pro a peace process in Israel, even when that wasn't so fashionable. But enormous prestige and been there for a very long time. And people wondered how he would ever be followed. Who could possibly follow an act like Lord Jacobowitz? And yet I think by the end of his chief rabbinate, and even since, Rabbi Sacks really exceeded his predecessor in all sorts of ways. In the run-up to being taking office as chief rabbi, Rabbi Sacks wrote a book called One People, ? Which to me, in terms of my religious outlook and my rabbinate, I think is, for me, the most important book he wrote in my own personal sort of journey and thinking. And it's really a case for inclusivist orthodoxy. It's an argument that the purpose of the United Synagogue, the purpose of his branch of orthodoxy, I think my branch, the branch of Sholom as well, is to really include as many people as possible within orthodoxy, to give as many people a place where they're comfortable within orthodoxy. So you can't compromise the halacha beyond a certain point, but you can make it known that this is a place where everybody is welcome, and where you don't set the halachic bar so high that it forces people out. So the Haredi community might set the bar very, very high indeed, even to what you wear. But an inclusive orthodoxy says, let's make this as broad a place as possible within what is possible, and there are limits to that, and therefore bring as many people together as possible. And that was really his vision for the United Synagogue and for his chief rabbinate in the time that would follow. And he came in a great wave of enthusiasm and optimism and support. But there's no question that in some senses he found the chief rabbinate role itself rather challenging. So you have here a paradox of Rabbi Sacks or his career, that he would not have become the international figure he did, or it's much less likely he would have become that figure, without the platform of the chief rabbinate. At the same time, I think he found the the Chief Rabbinate itself sometimes a challenging position to hold. And I think the difference is this. In his book, One People, he talks about orthodoxy having boundaries. And as an academic, as a lecturer, as a rabbi in a shul, but not with authority for the entire community, it's fairly easy to talk about what those boundaries are and sort of assert that there are boundaries. But the problem is that the role of a chief rabbi as really the authority figure in the community, in the religious aspect of the community, is to police those boundaries, not just to talk about them and lots of things as well, and not dwell on those boundaries, but actually be the person ultimately who decides, you know, when those boundaries are going to be enforced and how they're going to be enforced. And that's, I think that was a very difficult role for him, not one he liked, one he found very, very uncomfortable. So what happens over the course of Chief Rabbinate? So I think several things happen. One, he does shift to a more popular approach, and you see books like A Letter in the Scroll, which originally was called Radical Then, Radical Now. You see books like that appear. Books like Celebrating Life. I think the most recent book, one of the most recent books, was called Judaism's Life Lessons. These are books in a much more popular vein, unlike books like The Politics of Hope and The Persistence of Faith and Faith in the Future, which are much more technical works. Now, you do have technical works even more recently. I think The Great Partnership, about the relationship between science and religion, is a heavy technical book, but there was a mixture. There was a mixture of the heavier and the lighter, whereas before he'd really been exclusively a very heavy and technical writer. He also moves, I think, away from difficult issues in Judaism. So I mentioned the degree of difference a little while ago. So in response to 9/11, he wrote a book which is really an exploration of the limits of multiculturalism and faith and tolerance and pluralism and so on. And he says in a famous passage, "In heaven there is truth, on earth there are truths, and God spoke to Jews through Judaism and Muslims through Islam and Christians through Christianity." What exactly that means, if you fully unpack it, I'm not sure is ever going to be fully determined. But he got into a lot of hot water, and he had to revise the book and issue an amended version. And that, I think, is the end of his time trying to tackle difficult issues within Judaism. So the question of what level of pluralism can Judaism tolerate, which is really one of the questions of dignity of difference, this got him into tremendous hot water, and he leaves those questions alone. And instead he writes two different types of books from that time onwards. One is in the Jewish camp, explaining and exploring Jewish texts, the Haggadah, the Siddur, Machzorim, and eventually he was going to get around to the Chumash. In fact, I think this coming year was to be his year really trying to write his Chumash commentary. And it's a huge tragedy we will never see it, we'll never see it completed. I suppose we may see some early elements of it might be edited and released at some point. So there's that whole body of work, which is trying to make Jewish texts meaningful and inspiring to Jews and non-Jews if they chose to engage with them. And then on the other hand, you have a Jewish voice about general problems. For example, again, another sort of multiculturalism book, To Heal a Fractured World, and a third one, The Home We Build Together. These are not trying to solve problems within Judaism. They're trying to bring a Jewish voice to a general social or cultural problem. The Great Partnership I mentioned about science and religion, so that's all religions, that's all faiths in God, not just science. He can tackle that big problem and bring a Jewish and rabbinic voice to it, but without getting to the pitfalls of actually trying to solve internal Jewish problems and promote solutions which might be controversial. So that's one important shift. The way his concentration of his writing moves, and the way his style of his writing, at least part of it, moves. And also, it's very important to mention mention a common conversation, that he starts writing essays, really sermon-length essays, to send out to an increasingly large readership. Again, making the weekly Torah text more engaging, inspiring, and relevant to people, rather than trying to write technical academic discourses. I mentioned before that Rabbi Sacks was essentially a conservative. So one thing that doesn't change in his chief rabbinate is I don't think there's any significant shift towards more liberal positions on many issues. I'll give you the issue of women as one of those. It wasn't until Rabbi Mervis came along that a program similar to Maharat or Yoetzet Halacha called the Ma'ayan program was established. Rabbi Sacks didn't take any steps to have a training system for female Jewish clergy. I think it was only under Rabbi Mervis that women could become senior office holders of synagogues or of the United Synagogue as a whole. And Rabbi Sacks wasn't very keen on women's tefillah groups, certainly with the Sefer Torah being used. He was actually more conservative in some sense than issues, either than Rabbi Jakovovitz, his predecessor, or Rabbi Rabinovich, his teacher. I think were more liberal on some of these issues. But I think he was fundamentally a conservative figure, at least in terms of Jewish practice, and he maintained that conservatism. His skepticism about pluralism, a fundamental skepticism about pluralism, became more apparent. He stopped going to Limud, and I think that was more out of political pressure. And again, it was Rabbi Mervis who was the first chief rabbi to go to Limud when he took over in 2013. But also, I think he found it very difficult, just as a human being, to negotiate the tensions there. So famously, in 1997, Rabbi Hugo Grin, who was a Reform rabbi, a Holocaust survivor, and a major public figure in Britain, died. Rabbi Sacks didn't go to the funeral and was attacked for that. Went to the memorial service instead and was attacked for that from the right. He ended up pleasing nobody. But I think this was part of his personal difficulty he had, not through malice, but through a sort of political difficulty in how you negotiate these very difficult communal role and communal expectations. And when you hold the line and when you concede and when you, he wasn't deft in that way. He wasn't a natural religious politician, which isn't necessarily to his detriment. He was also, I have to say, very unfairly the target of really very mean attacks in the Jewish press. Somebody pointed out to me, who's lived in both Britain and South Africa and Canada, the Anglo-Jewish press, the British Jewish press, is uniquely unpleasant around the world. And the Jewish Chronicle in particular was really gunning for him for a very long time. And then Stanley Kalms turned on him. So he was the victim of many unfair attacks. And in fact, I've heard from people since he died that when they turned to him and said, I'm being criticized, I'm being attacked, it's not fair, he would say, well, first of all, you're saying something. If people are attacking you, you're saying something and you're doing something. You're not just inert. And two, it doesn't matter. People attack you, it doesn't matter. If you've got something of value to say, then it will be received, and the attacks of the people won't matter. In fact, when he stood down as chief rabbi, Meir Persoff, who's a former Jewish Chronicle journalist, wrote a really hatchet job biography of him called Another Way, Another Time, which is actually taken from one of Rabbi Sacks's own speeches, and it didn't land a blow. It was a pretty thorough attempt to totally sort of dismantle his entire achievement and personality, and no one cared. Everyone moved on, and I think the chief rabbi, this in particular, Rabbi Sacks, suffered a lot of slings and arrows, and suffered a lot from that. But in fact, he came out on top in the end. Now, although he had this sort of difficult time theologically in the early 2000s, when he stepped down in 2013, it was quite clear he'd overcome all of those, because he was appointed as the visiting professor at Yeshiva University and also at New York University, and spent part of several years in New York. And this was part of his great 7 years as an emeritus chief rabbi, handed over to Rabbi Mervis in 2013. And the years that followed were really tremendous for him. He went and spoke all over the world. He was given every award and honor one could possibly imagine, the same as his predecessor and more. He was translated into Hebrew for the first time and achieved a following in Israel which was new amongst Hebrew speakers as well as English speakers. And his Siddur, he wrote a commentary and edited a new edition of the Siddur for the United Synagogue. But it was so good, the best edition, for 100 years, that it was taken by Koren and was the basis of the new Koren Siddur, and then the new Koren Machzorim, all the festival prayer books. And in fact, people thought that the art scroll hegemony in terms of Siddurim was pretty much total, even in modern Orthodoxy. And the Sacks prayer books are so good that, in fact, Koren, I think, is now as and becoming more important in the modern Orthodox sector. And that's really Rabbi Sacks's achievement. He was a very deft user of social media, or at least his office was. So his videos and presentations and so on, he used Facebook, and he used Instagram, and he used YouTube extremely effectively, and got his message out there. So it was really a very great 7 years since he retired as chief rabbi, when he left the confines of Anglo-Jewry, with all of its complications and political aspects and difficulties, and could reach out to the rest of the world, the whole world, and the Jewish world in particular, and unfettered by those constraints, could really breathe and stretch and make a big contribution. That didn't mean he expressed views which were any more controversial, but I think I noticed in him, actually, in the contrast between when he was chief rabbi and when he wasn't, there was just such a greater degree of comfort and relaxation, and you could just see the anxiety level had dropped tremendously in just the way he carried himself and the way he spoke. I think it was the best 7 years of his life, certainly of his professional life. And the only tragedy is that it was cut short. He had 10 or 20 years good work left in him if cancer hadn't taken him at the age of 72. So we should be grateful that we had all those years and we had such a body of work, even if we're sad that more could not be produced. So that's what I wanted to say to begin with, and then very happy to take maybe another 15 minutes or so of questions and comments.
I have a question. Rabbi Elton, fantastic. This was incredible. And thank you so much. First of all, I have a question about Rabbi Sacks. I also would love to hear about your shul and how you're doing down there. I'm very excited that you're speaking to us from Australia. It's just amazing to hear you. And I was really I learned so much in these past few minutes from you, so thank you for that. My question for you is, one of the areas where, there's no doubt I was inspired every week by Rabbi Sacks' Divrei Torah, and you touched upon it. I was a little disappointed that he wasn't as liberal on intra-Jewish areas, but one of the areas where I think he was bold, and I'd like to hear from you about it, is in interreligious behavior or interreligious dialogue. And there he did take a lot of risk, even as a chief rabbi. So what's your thought about that?
So there's a very interesting young man called Rabbi Dr. Samuel Liebens, who you may have heard of. Young, he's in his late 30s, I suppose now, and he's really looked at Rabbi Sacks's view of pluralism and therefore how it relates to interfaith. And it's very difficult to unpick exactly what he thought. But I think fundamentally he did believe that it's impossible for human beings to have access to truth, to complete truth. The Rambam says that also, no human mind can encompass the fullness of God. And therefore anything which comes to human beings, even the Torah, which speaks in human language and is a document in this world. It's not a heavenly Torah in your world, it's a Torah which is in the earth and is read by human beings and understood by them as best they can. Whether that's the written Torah or the oral Torah, even more so applies to the Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's going to be limited. It must be limited. You can't confine God to language. And therefore, there really might be insights about God which have come to other human beings, not in the Jewish tradition. When any person who believes in God and is trying to connect and understand more about God through his or her God-given intellect, then if they happen to be a Muslim or a Christian or a Buddhist, then how can you say they're not going to get insights? And if they get insights, why do you have to say that all those insights were already contained within what Jews have achieved? So it might well be the case that God does speak to Christians through Christianity. That is there. It doesn't have to be totally theologically accurate in every way, what the nature of the Godhead is. But nevertheless, Christians who are engaged in their spiritual journey through the vehicle of Christianity, or the Muslims through Islam, they are having real spiritual insights, and they're having real new understandings about God, and therefore God does speak to them through their own faith tradition, and they bring something new which we in Judaism don't have. And by the way, you see this in practice. For example, in Rav Soloveitchik, there's no question, I think Alan Brill has shown this, there's no question that Rav Soloveitchik takes on ideas from certain mid-century Christian theologians. So it's not just Reform or conservative figures which use certain movements in Christianity. Rav Soloveitchik, even a traditionalist, is reading mid-century Christian Protestant theology and is gaining something from it. Were those insights in the Torah? Well, if they were, why did he go and look in these other theologians? And I think Rabbi Sacks is saying something like that. But that was very difficult to swallow and rather hard to explain. And I think his main problem in the book was he didn't explain it fully because he was on this journey from being technical to being more popular. So that's a few disjointed thoughts.
I have a question.
Yes, with pleasure.
My question is, did you know Rabbi Sacks?
I met him 2 or 3 times. When I wrote my PhD on the Chief Rabbinate, I went to see him. I sent him my thesis and I went to see him, we chatted about it. And then when he came to New York on one of his visits, and I was there at that time, he came to Lincoln Square where I was then working, and we had a very nice interaction. And he said to me, if I ever needed his assistance, I should just be in touch, which is a very touching offer that he made on that occasion.
Thanks.
Rabbi Elton?
Yes.
To your knowledge, or based on your study of Rabbi Sacks, how did he address Christian anti-Semitism, particularly the historical legacy of the papacy and Christian thinking through this many centuries, and the role of papal reform in recent times?
Well, one of his major contributions in his period in the House of Lords was really pushing back against anti-Semitism. And he was more concerned in its modern form, which is the sort of left-wing anti-Zionism, which borders into anti-Semitism or falls over the border into anti-Semitism. So he would say in the medieval period, Jews were hated because of their religion. And in the 19th century, we were hated because of our race. And the 21st century, we were hated because of our state. So he was very well aware of the evolution of anti-Semitism, but most of his activity was involved in combating anti-Semitism in its contemporary form, and also combating the sort of very virulent forms of anti-Zionism. So I don't think he really concentrated on the Catholic aspects. He was really interested in pushing back the threat to Jews and to Israel as it existed in his own time.
Thank you.
Thank you. As Rabbi Herzfeld asked for a little bit of information about my shul, I'm very, very happy to share that for a couple of minutes. So this is the Great Synagogue. We've been here since 1878. Jews arrived on the first fleet of convicts in 1788. And in fact, they were going to go to America in the late 18th century. But in fact, the American Revolution put paid to the idea of sending convicts to the North American colonies, so they had to turn south. They went to Australia instead. So about 16 Jews stagger off the first fleet of convict ships in 1788, and they're all sent all over the place to work in the fields, to work in industry, to work as servants. And so they don't do very much that's Jewish for quite a while. In 1817, there's a Jewish burial. In 1828, there's the first service. They use the Chumash, not a Sefer Torah. There's no Sefer Torah in Australia at that time. They use the Chumash, and we have the Chumash. We still have the Chumash that was used at that first service in 1828. 1844, they build a shul with 2 Sefer Torah brought from London and the 2 sets of Rimonim, the Torah finials, civil finials, which go on top. We have those as well in our collection. And there's marriages taking place in the 1830s. We have the marriage records from the 1830s, the first marriage performed in Australia. In fact, because people stay here forever, basically, I did a marriage about 3 years ago of a descendant of the first marriage ever to take place in Australia. So there's this enormous longevity in terms of the community. The community gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So they build the Great Synagogue, which has 900 seats, but only 500 members, because there are Jews living all over New South Wales. In all these little towns, the Jews have the dry goods store, and they live there for the year, but they come into Sydney for the high holidays. So the shul has to be able to what's the word? Anyway, provide space for, accommodate. It has to accommodate all of these people who come in just for the high holidays. The shul was the major shul in Sydney for 50 years after it was founded. But of course, then other shuls crop up. A reform shul in 1938. There's only one reform shul on this side of the bridge and a small reform shul on the other side of the bridge, and sort of 35 Orthodox shuls, very much a Commonwealth model. Almost everyone is affiliated to Orthodoxy. Other shuls pop up. So at the height of my shul in the 1950s, when there's lots of immigration from Europe and from Britain as well, there are 1,600 members of my shul. And then as more shuls open, of course, that dissipates. So when I arrived, we had 700 members, and we've gained, 300 people have joined since I arrived, and 200 people have died. So over the last 5 or 6 years, it was an aging congregation. So we're now 100 up. We're now more at 800 and 700 that we were 6 years ago. But that is composed of really almost 50% of the congregation now have joined in my time, and are new members of the congregation, a younger demographic. When I arrived, we had 4 bar and bar mitzvahs the year I arrived. Last year there were 17 bar and bar mitzvahs in the shul. So really, it's been a time of a lot of growth, a lot of hard work. I was very pleased to be able to hire for the first time an associate rabbi last year, Rabbi Phil Kaplan, who came with his wife Abra. They just had a son, Roe, and he's been a tremendous help. He ran the bar mitzvah program this year, and he has been sort of very active in all areas of the shul's work, particularly during lockdown, where we had to pivot to being online and then ease our way back into in-person services, which we could do earlier than other places in the world, but which has still been difficult. I think now, whereas we used to have 100 people on a regular Shabbos morning, now we're down to sort of 60 or 70. So there's a real effort which we are going through now to build that back up again. When I arrived, there was sort of 30 or 40 on a Shabbos, and we built it up. Now I've had a setback, we have to push again and build again. But that's what the Rabbinate's all about, just constantly trying to push and to build. And we'll see what the world looks like in Jewish terms after COVID. We don't know yet, but Rabbi Herzfeld maybe will have a view, but I think you just have to keep trying different things and fail forward and hope for the best. Keep working.
That's excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah, Helene, maybe
Yeah.
we'll do last question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I'm just confirming with you. You said initially that Rabbi Sacks said that God spoke to Jews through Judaism, and he spoke to Christians through Christianity, and he spoke to Muslims through their faith, and he got into trouble with that, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was toned down, but that's his original draft. That's his most interesting. most interesting sort of pluralistic statement, I think.
Did he still believed it, but he toned it down?
Well, I think he said he was very happy to rephrase what he said, but he didn't retract, but he was very happy to rephrase for the avoidance of any confusion.
Right. Thank you so much.
Ben, he talked about that once when he was over here, and he laughed and he said, see if you can spot the difference between the two editions.
Yes.
What book was it?
Dignity of Difference.
Dignity of Difference, yeah.
I had the first edition.
Oh, thank you.
Ben, Rabbi Elton?
Yes.
Can you explain in general, what the duties of a chief rabbi are, or specifically the chief rabbi of England, as opposed to countries like the United States that don't have that institution?
Yes. Essentially, he's the rabbinic authority for all the synagogues under his jurisdiction. So any problems at all that occur in any of those shuls, we have to apply to a higher authority figure. All those problems come across his desk. So there's the general business of encouraging and inspiring and opening shuls and inducting new rabbis, but also a huge amount of the rabbi and the chazan have fallen out, or there's a huge broigus over here, or what do we do about this problem in the shul? They all came to him, and he had to be a problem solver for the whole of his community of thousands and thousands of people.
Was it a Pesach solution that he gave, or these were just political problems that he had to solve?
If you wanted a halachic ruling, you went to the Sydney Beth Din. If you wanted a sort of advice on how to solve a problem, you went to the chief rabbi. So, and also he was a rabbi's rabbi as well. So when rabbis had personal problems, who do they go to? They go to the chief rabbi. A friend of mine wanted to know whether to apply for a particular job or not. He went to Rabbi Sacks, he gave him advice, as one would go to one's rabbi.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for this. Your command of the history and the story is just really remarkable. And thank you for sharing him with us. And yeah, it's crazy to think that we should be wishing you a good Shabbos, because for you, Shabbos is very soon, right? Yeah.
I was just going to say that before everybody goes, we should also mention we have the other lecture.
Yes, that's what I was gonna, yes. And so on December 24th at 8 p.m., Dr. Erica Brown will also be giving a talk that's fine, about Rabbi Sacks as well. And so we're grateful to hear from multiple scholars providing different perspectives on his legacy and his memory. So thank you, Rabbi Elton, Rabbi Dr. Once again, I guess British rabbis get multiple titles. So thank you once again. It's wonderful to see you. I'm amazed and so impressed that the technology held up. And so thank you once again for sharing everything. Please send your family a good Shabbos and a happy Chanukah from all of us. And thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now. Rabbi Elton, if you would like to stick around and chat for a minute, you're welcome to. And if not, I'm sure there's plenty to do before Shabbos starts for you.
I just want to thank everyone very much and the opportunity. And it's so nice to see people and learn with you, and wish everyone